So now we're going to look at relabeling people in order to transform their behaviour. So remember the Pygmalion effect. In other words, when we label people, form an opinion of people and have expectations of people, we trap them in those expectations, in that label, in that behaviour. Nothing they can do can change our minds, because everything they do is just used as more evidence that they're the label that we've given them. For example, someone you dislike gives you flowers, and potentially you might be suspicious of why they're trying to butter you up, but you don't change the label that you dislike them or that you don't trust them. You're more likely to use their behavior and twist the reason they did it to meet your to fit your belief about them. So we're going to use this process to relabel people so that we can open up the possibility of us being able to see them differently, respond to them differently, and as a result, get a different response from them. So you'll start to see people's behavior change as soon as you start to use this process. And the best thing about it is that you'll never actually need to sit down and have a conversation about their behavior with them. You change, and as a consequence, they change. So first step is, what's the label you've given the person or their behavior? If you can label their behavior, it's better. It'll be more accurate. The next thing is, what extreme event or events would have to happen for you to do that behavior? Now, I know you wouldn't ever behave that way, so that's why we say extreme event. What would have to happen that would cause you to exhibit that same behavior? Really stretch yourself, imagine what would have to be happening. Okay. And then if that was happening, what label would you give yourself in that situation? Now, this one is critical because part of the problem when we judge somebody's behavior is that we look at the situation and decide that we would never behave like that in that situation. But what we're seeing is their behavior in our perspective of the situation. So, of course, it doesn't make sense. We're not seeing their behavior in their perspective of the situation. So, the way this technique works is to help you figure out how they must be seeing the situation for them to behave that way. They must have given a situation a particular meaning that for them warrants that behavior. So put yourself into an entirely different context where you'd behave that way, and you'll see what meaning they might have given this situation. It doesn't matter if they're right to see the situation that way or not. It's how they're seeing things, and that's their reality. All you can do is seek to understand and work with them in their reality in order to get a shift. So the next question is, how might you respond differently to someone with that label? And then finally, how might they respond differently to you in return? Now, this can turn your perspective on human behavior completely on its head and boost your emotional intelligence too. So when you do this exercise, you'll realize the micromanager doesn't micromanage because they just love having control over you. They feel they have no control, and they perceive huge risk if things go wrong, if they haven't covered all the bases. And the more they try to reassure themselves that you're doing the right things, you're doing a good job, the more annoyed you get at their controlling behavior. And then you pull away and you stop volunteering the information. You make it harder for them to get their reassurance. So the more they have to chase you for that information, the less they trust that everything's going to be fine. And by doing the counterintuitive thing and volunteering more information to them, by almost overwhelming them with data and information about your every thought and deed, they can relax that you have it in hand and they'll feel safe to leave you alone. So whilst you're seeing them as this aggressor, that's trying to make your life miserable, who doesn't trust you because you're not worthy, you're missing the whole point in that they are the ones that are panicking. They are the ones in fear. And you are the obstacles to them. You're the one that's being obstinate. You're the one that's withholding. So if you can recognize that's must be happening for that person, you can have a little bit of compassion, but also common sense and think, well, what's your outcome? Do you want them to change their behavior? You change yours and you will get what you want, just in the complete opposite way to the way that you perhaps have been doing it. So let's work through an example for you. Okay, so what's the label that you've given the person or their behavior or extreme events? Okay. So let's say the label is aggressive or unreasonable. Okay, so what extreme event would have to happen for you to be aggressive or unreasonable? Really stretch yourself to think. For me, it would be perhaps if someone was threatening me or someone I loved. Next question, what label would you give yourself in that situation? Well, if I perceived somebody to be threatening me or someone I loved, then the label I would give myself would be defensive, intimidated, scared. Now, if that's what that person was, if you knew that the person that you're talking about was actually defensive, intimidated, and scared, as you would be in that extreme situation, how might you respond differently to someone with that label? And most of the time, if you can empathize enough, you realize you would actually try to be more reassuring, be a bit calmer and more patient. So again, rather than seeing them as the aggressor, you'd realize, gosh, something's making them really intimidated and scared. I need to reassure them and be more patient. How might they respond differently in response? Well, maybe they'd be calmer and more receptive. So as you can see, that's just one example. It really is important that you work this through yourself. And just remember, the outcome is for their behavior to change. And by doing this process, you can very quickly not just get the outcome, but living with people who you perceive, as to be badly behaved, difficult, and challenging can really take its toll on us. So this has a beneficial effect in that when you see people's behavior rather than aggressive, but as fearful, it changes the way that you perceive them day to day. And it becomes a lot less stressful to deal with, because rather than seeing yourself as the victim of somebody else, you realize that somebody else is actually in huge amounts of pain quite often, and is really challenged. And you recognize, gosh, okay, it's not what I thought it was. So this can really, really change things for people. So the next thing to think about is more broadly how to deal with challenging behaviors in general. We have to remember, hurt people hurt people. Happy people, when their needs are met, tend to be very nice to everybody and tend to be very easy to get along with. People who are experiencing high levels of love, significance, and certainty tend to be very kind, very easygoing, happy, lovely people. So let's start with the premise that challenging behaviours are coming from a place of pain. And these people will experience themselves as the victim of some situation. Now, we know that most pain is because of a lack of or threat to somebody's emotional needs. So which is it? Is it connection, certainty, or significance? Most challenging behaviours are just evidence that someone is desperate to protect or meet their human needs. So we can have compassion for that because we've all felt it. Anger comes from feeling insignificant, small, or threatened. Frustration comes from feeling helpless. Sadness comes from a loss of connection. The bully is often the one that feels the most threatened and hard done by. I have never in my 17 years spoken to a bully, perhaps somebody who's been accused of bullying in the corporate world and been sent to me for some coaching and sort of rehabilitation. I've never ever spoken to someone accused of bullying who didn't feel entirely 100% that they were the victim. So it really can help your emotional intelligence to appreciate these human behaviours. So let's think how to deal with challenging behaviours. Rule number 1, people make you feel how they feel. First thing to do is ask yourself how is this behavior making me feel? Because perhaps that is how they feel. So if this is making me feel stressed out, then that's what they're trying to communicate to me that they feel. Next is take responsibility. Now, you don't have to be sorry for living, but it is okay to be sorry about the fact that some interaction with you caused somebody to be upset, even if it had nothing, it wasn't your intention, and it's not necessarily your fault, but it's okay to say, hey, look, I accept my responsibility in this part of the relationship. And remember, responsibility is about your ability to respond, not about blame. So if you have the ability to respond and change that relationship, it's okay to take that responsibility and do something about it. So consider, could something that you've said or done have made them feel isolated, rejected, insignificant, helpless? Because if you did, that's probably relatively easy to rectify. And thirdly, look to regain rapport. So challenging behaviour is an indication that you've lost rapport. So to regain rapport, you need to validate and empathise feelings and perspectives. So being able to see it from that person's point of view, get your ego out of the way. And again, like I said, you don't have to be sorry for living or breathing. You don't have to be sorry for what you said or did even, but you can be sorry that somebody's upset, and you can look to rectify a situation. And when you can, when you have the ability to do it, it will again give you so much more influence, so much more peace of mind, and it will certainly help you achieve more of your outcomes to be able to do that.